Welcome to an inside look at Hilltown Land Trust, a webinar presented on February 5th, 2026 by Sally Loomis, our Executive Director, and Jess Applin, our Conservation and Stewardship Manager.
Our plan for this session is to give you a brief overview of Hilltown Land Trust and how we operate. We will explain some basic conservation options and share a bit about our process for taking on new conservation projects. Jess will offer some details on caring for conserved land, and then we hope to have about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Let's see. So I thought a good place to start would be, what does a land trust do? Because ask anybody and you'll get a different answer to this. At the core of our mission is permanently conserving land, and there's two main tools we use to do that, which I will talk about in a few minutes. We also need to monitor that conservation land as well as our public trails at least once a year, and then care for that conserved land. In addition, an important part of what we do is to engage and educate the public, get people excited about the outdoors and the natural world. And I'll just mention that a lot of the work we do is in partnership with other organizations, whether they're other conservation organizations or other community groups that interface with different aspects of our work and of the Hilltowns. So this is a map of our service area. We cover 13 very small towns west of the Connecticut River, dabbling into all four Western Mass counties. We have been affiliated with the trustees since the end of 2009, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. We have grown from a staff of one part-time person in 2010 to a team of 7. At the moment, and we currently have responsibility for some 50 conservation lands. 10 of those are cared for directly by Hilltown Land Trust, and 40 are in private stewardship, mostly with conservation restrictions over them. And then we also have 12 public trails. Many of those trails are on the lands cared for by Hilltown Land Trust or on the private conservation restriction land, but some of those are actually trail easements that we hold. And then just at the bottom of the screen is Hilltown Land Trust's mission. We revised our mission statement back in 2023 as we were updating our strategic plan. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the faces behind Hilltown Land Trust. So this photo collage is the Hilltown Land Trust staff. We have 6 staff members, and then Kala, who is our current TerraCore member. So the 6 staff members are permanent positions, some full-time, some part-time, and then the TerraCore position is something that usually rotates year to year with a new person, but we're very fortunate to have the partnership with TerraCore, which really helps scaffold a lot of the volunteer engagement at our organization. We also have an amazing board of directors. There's 10 people on our board with 2 honorary board members in addition to that. And these folks live in the hill towns, as do all the staff, and are very engaged in their community. If you know any of the people on the staff or on the board, I'm sure anyone would be delighted to talk to you about Hilltown Land Trust. These folks really give a lot to the organization in terms of time and brain powers. So yeah, I wanted to give you a sense of the full HLT team. The trustees, we have a very special relationship with the trustees. We've had a formal affiliation between our 2 organizations since the end of 2009. And the trustees really provides a lot of back office support to Hilltown Land Trust, particularly in the areas of financial management, IT support, HR support. They also give us great advice as we conduct land conservation projects and think about ways that we're caring for conservation land. But HLT also has a fair amount of independence. We conduct land conservation transactions on our own and under our own name. We raise our own funds and develop our own strategic plan. And then we offer some back to the trustees as well, mainly in the form of sort of community connections in the hill towns. And it's been really exciting over the past year and a half to see that affiliation really come to fruition as the trustees has leaned more into land conservation work in this region. So at this juncture, I'm going to turn it back over to Jess.
Hi. So why conserve land in the first place? Why is our mission so important? There is a huge ecological impact to conserving land. We're protecting ecosystems, our native biodiversity. We're conserving wildlife habitat and special natural communities across the landscape. And we're connecting and expanding on conservation areas, providing connectivity that's going to help build resiliency across the land. Next. We also want to conserve land for the impact it has on people. Connecting people to land and reconnecting people to land is really important for overall human health. It allows access for recreation. We're preserving the scenic and natural beauty of the landscape, as well as really important cultural places. We're also protecting the drinking water, promoting soil health, supporting clean air, all the things that we need to survive and that everything else that lives here needs to survive. And also trying to increase food security opportunities when and where we can. Next. And then there's the big picture impact. And all of these things work together and support each other, but conserving land helps with overall climate mitigation. It allows us to sequester and store more carbon on the landscape, and again, build that resiliency so that everything has more time to adapt as things change.
So I'm going to talk a bit about options for permanent land conservation. There's two main tools that we use. One is acquiring land and then holding on to it. And the other is the conservation restriction tool. And as I talk about land conservation, and just as well, you'll notice that we are shying away from using the term land ownership and really taking a lesson from our Indigenous partners that we need to be in relationship with the land, and we shouldn't be owning land like one should not own a person, but we should be caring for the land and being in relationship with it. Though I will admit it's a little clunky in English, and we will slip into the term land ownership when we don't have the right words. So acquire and hold. This is, really when we take ownership of a piece of land and permanently conserve it. And that can happen through somebody giving us their land, through a bargain sale.
Sally, I think we lost you for a moment.
A discounted sale, and when somebody's looking for a content outcome for their land, it's important for them to find the right conservation partner. And that means a lot of things in terms of capacity, but also an alignment of values between the conservation organization and the person who wants to conserve their land. And then the conservation organization needs to make sure they have the capacity to both complete a transaction and then care for the land into the future. The other slight that we often use is called a conservation restriction. And this is the same thing as a conservation easement, which is how it tends to be referred to in other states in this country. And that's a permanent legal tool that dictates how land can and cannot be used into the future, really forever. And that conservation restriction runs with the land. So if the land changes hands, whether it's passed down to a relative or sold to somebody else, the conservation restriction still exists over that land. And a conservation restriction typically extinguishes rights that would harm the land, but allows other things to continue. But not always. So agriculture may be allowed to continue on the land if there's already land used for agriculture that's appropriate to use in that way. And similarly, forest management can continue on some conservation restriction lands, but it's a right that's extinguished on others. Through the conservation restriction, the land remains in private ownership and private management. And there needs to be a conservation organization holding the conservation restriction and then visiting that land once a year or monitoring it. So, as I just said, there needs to be a conservation partner in any of these transactions. And this collage of logos is many, or not, if not most, of the organizations active in Western Massachusetts as possible conservation partners, with the exception of town conservation commissions, which can also be conservation partners. And often two or more conservation partners will work together on a project. And we have an example in a few minutes that will highlight some different partnerships that Hilltown Land Trust has been involved in. And then how do land conservation projects come to the land trust? Well, all the ways that you see highlighted on this screen. Somebody might contact us expressing an interest in a conservation option for their land, or one of our partner organizations, whether that's a town or a state agency or another land trust, may get in touch asking if we would be interested in a particular project. And sometimes that relates to proximity. You know, we have adjacent conservation land, for example. Sometimes it's a community member, could be one of you, who gets in touch with us, noting that somebody they know is thinking about options for the future of their land, or perhaps that a piece of land is already on the market and it might be of conservation interest. And then more recently, Hilltown Land Trust has been able to pursue strategic conservation projects where we would approach somebody and ask if they might be interested in a conservation option for their land. And that's a fairly new thing for us, but it's an exciting area to delve into. And now it's back to Jess.
So an important question to ask is, how do we decide what projects we can and can't take on? We're a very small land trust, and there are always more projects coming to us than we have the time and energy and capacity to do. So that we have to evaluate each of those projects and try to prioritize so that the ones that we're taking on have the biggest impact, have the biggest bang for your buck. Certain things that we're looking at are the ecological attributes, things like habitats, soils, the water resources, climate resilience. We're also looking at the size and the proximity to other conservation lands. Can we build on connectivity that's already there and strengthen the landscape? We're also looking at those cultural and scenic and recreation values. Can we connect people to the land? And then we're also looking at the development threat. You know, is it all wetlands, which is, protected by the Mass Wetlands Protection Act already? Or is it, a landlocked parcel in the middle of nowhere where nobody is ever going to be able to get to develop in the first place? Those are some of the questions we're asking in terms of ecological criteria. There's also an administrative side to things. Funding options. So is there funding available to meet the needs of that particular piece of land, whether that be internal or through grant funding? Do we have the capacity as an organization? Meaning, do we have staff time? Sometimes the list is really long and there's just not enough time in the day to take on another project. Or are we the very best partner for this project? Sally listed a whole bunch of different partners. There's a lot of good land trusts out there. Everybody kind of has a different mission, and the lands has different needs. Landowners, deed holders have different needs that they're looking for. So we want to make sure we find the best fit. And it's really important to note that sometimes we have to say no, and it's not an easy decision, and we hope to find a good fit and pass it off, but we do the best we can to take on as much as we can. There's also many resources that we take advantage of to help with this evaluation. One of the first things we do is kind of this desk assessment. We look at the data that's available to us, and there's a lot of good free resources out there. One I want to highlight for you all is Mass Mapper. It's the state-run website. It's all of our Mass GIS data. It covers habitats and soils and wetlands and pretty much anything you can imagine. It is available to you all, so please investigate it if you so choose. There's also a whole bunch of data that is supplied free, again, by organizations like the Nature Conservancy or UMass, different supportive groups that are just helping to support the overall mission. The map shown here is an example of that from the Nature Conservancy. This is looking at biodiversity and resiliency data. And I want you to notice specifically the Hilltown service area that's marked on this map and how much it lights up across the landscape. This is a really important region for us to be doing this work. It has some of the highest biodiversity values. It has some of the lowest development and most intact forests. And it has some of the greatest opportunity to build on that connectivity that we keep talking about, to build that resiliency for change over time. So please, if you are interested, go investigate or ask us questions, because the more of you all that know how to play with this, the stronger that we're going to be as a team.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to give a little case study. I'm going to start it, and Jess is going to continue it, about an area where we've done a lot of different conservation projects that really highlight some of what we've been telling you. So this is the Jackson Brook corridor. It is really the line between Worthington on the left side of the map and Chesterfield on the right side of the map. And the partnership work with respect to conservation in this area started in the late 1990s, when the Nature Conservancy and Hilltown Land Trust were involved in, I think, 5 different conservation or parcels of conservation land. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but these parcels that are sort of shaded in a solid tan color are conservation restrictions that came to Hilltown Land Trust at that time. And then these 2 pieces of land labeled Jackson Swamp are properties where we took ownership of the land. In technical speak at a land trust, we call these fee properties, and it's a legal term. So if you ever hear that, that's what it means. So fast forward then to somewhere around 2015, when the Nature Conservancy was doing a wildlife tracking study. And they asked various landowners for permission to walk their land, and then shared some of the results of the study with the people whose land had been involved. And through that effort, the people who owned this southern half of this Conwell property at the bottom of the map were inspired by the wildlife value or the wildlife habitat value on their land, and the results of this wildlife tracking study. And they got in touch with the Nature Conservancy, expressing interest in donating some of their family land for conservation purposes. And the Nature Conservancy then got back in touch with Hilltown Land Trust because we have so many holdings in the area. And the result of that was Hilltown Land Trust receiving the donation of about 70 acres of land that we named the Conwell property. And it's Conwell family land, and Russell Conwell is a very well-known figure in the town of Worthington, so it seemed fitting to name that property for the family who'd given us the donation. And then a few years later, an adjacent 105 acres that was also part of that same family's land was able to be purchased by Hilltown Land Trust thanks to some funding and a partnership with Mass Wildlife. And what we did in this situation was Hilltown Land Trust purchased the land, but we sold a conservation restriction on that land to Mass Wildlife. That allows us to align the management of this land with some adjacent land that Mass Wildlife has. What you are not appreciating maybe on this map is that there's just thousands and thousands of acres of green attached to this, sort of to the south and to the east and to the west, including a lot of land cared for by Mass Wildlife. So they hold a conservation restriction over our land. They have some say in what can and cannot happen on Hilltown Land Trust's land. So, for example, there's a nice established network of trails on that land that can continue, but we probably won't be making a lot more trails on that property. And if we ever needed to do some management work there, we would do that in partnership with Mass Wildlife. And then the even more exciting thing is what is happening now. Through conversations with the neighbors, we are working again with Mass Wildlife to potentially conserve an additional 450 acres. So the pieces of land on this map that have stripes or cross-hatching are some of the parcels involved in that next phase. And then there's additional land that will likely be included, but it's a little premature to put it on a public map. But we're very excited about this prospect of really filling in the gaps in that Jackson Brook corridor, so that it's a solid block of conservation land. The area has incredibly important wildlife habitat. We've got lots and lots of footage of wildlife camera imagery of all sorts of wildlife there. And we're just very excited about working on this partnership project. And the partnership will also help us further align the land stewardship goals in the region. And I'm just going to turn it back to Jess to talk more about this.
So the conservation of all this land is incredibly important. But then we also need to take the responsibility of taking care of that land. And we want to make sure that we're doing that in the most meaningful way possible. We are a very small regional land trust, and when we take on land, we need to consider all the stewardship options. We need to consider all the needs of the land itself and all the needs of the communities that live here, and try to find a balance somewhere in there that works for everything. So how do we go about doing that? The first most important thing that we can do is relationship building. We need to get to know the land. We need to get out there, understand it, be in relationship with it. We also need to get to know the neighbors and build relationships with them. They are a powerful source of knowledge and part of the story. Doing that allows us to collaborate and have deeper conversations. What is really special in the Jackson Swamp corridor is that all the landowners here are deeply connected and in love with this landscape. They are committed, they're engaged, and they want to talk. So we can use that. And then there's Mass Wildlife, like Sally mentioned. They've been a partner here for a very long time, and they're also deeply engaged in this conversation. So we pool all that knowledge together so that we can make responsible decisions. Those conversations, spending time there, they kind of revealed two big major themes for the Jackson Brook corridor. One was that connection to landscape, that connection to the land and to the animals was incredibly important to everybody, but everybody wants it to be done in a way that doesn't disrupt the wildlife that live there. And the other big thing was to make sure that we're protecting the wildlife itself. This has been identified as a major wildlife corridor with some really special habitat, and we want to make sure it stays that way and can function the way it needs to. This is a collaborative effort, which the exciting part of seeing it at that landscape scale, it allows us to consider stewardship at that level, to consider everything and talk to everybody and not just do things parcel by parcel. So in context with the land, which is really, really exciting stuff. So first big goal that was revealed by these collaborative conversations, connecting people to the landscape. Sally mentioned the Conwell property down at the very south end of things, right on 112. There was an opportunity to build a trail system there. It was an area that was already somewhat heavily forested historically. There was a little bit of disturbance, but it was an excellent place for access. It allowed folks to get in there, experience the land, experience the wildlife, see some truly spectacular and beautiful places, and not disrupt too much. We also incorporate wildlife cameras into all the work we do because it's an incredible resource for gaining information about wildlife and what's going on. But it's also a really important tool to share and connect people with the land and the wildlife that live there in a way that's not too disruptive. We don't have to have an impact. And hopefully they don't mind us going in every now and then to switch the cameras out. It keeps them on their toes. That wildlife camera effort was also adopted pretty enthusiastically by a few of the neighbors across Jackson Brook Swamp. We have a lot of neighbors who have either bought their own cameras or are offering to rotate some of ours to help with this mission. And they're sharing what they're seeing on the land through the cameras, through their own eyes. They're sharing it with each other. We're sharing it with all of you through, you can see some stuff on YouTube and social media. And then we're taking all that and sharing it with Mass Wildlife so that we can have this really big picture connection to the land.
Sorry, Jess, I launched that a little sooner than I meant to.
Okay.
Here's an example.
I am not involved in any presentation that doesn't have a video of some kind of wildlife. So I have to share it with you. Go look at our YouTube page. It's super fun. That leads us to our other big goal. Or you can watch the bear again.
There, I got
I
it.
can watch them all day. It's fun. You can turn the volume up too. The other major goal for Jackson Swamp was to protect the habitat that was already there. Like I said, recognized, intact, really special place for wildlife. We have moose on the landscape. They are a really important indicator that that land is functioning as a corridor. They need a lot of habitat diversity and a lot of land to get what they need to survive. So the fact that they're there is just kind of seals the deal in terms of we need to maintain this as a wildlife corridor and protect it the best we can. A lot of special natural communities, a lot of really important places in here, and we want to keep that way. So we're looking for stressors. We're keeping an eye on things, not just with the wildlife cameras. We're getting out there on foot. We're looking at the land. There are invasive plants. They are everywhere to some degree. We want to make sure they don't infiltrate the main corridor. We have neighbors helping with this that have more heavily infested areas on the edges of things that are helping by trying to keep it out of the interior. We also have really dedicated, excited volunteers who build beautiful things like the duck box in the photo on the right. He built us two of these really amazing duck boxes that were installed last year, and I believe that are getting serviced tomorrow. So I'll be able to report back on whether anybody moved in. But regardless of whether they moved in or not, things like this where we can give back to the land and reduce some of the stress if and when they choose they might need it, is something fun and meaningful that we can also do and look for opportunities to do more things like that. I think that covers it.
Okay, great. So hopefully you've gotten the sense that we have some great conservation opportunities out here. And as Jess mentioned, the Hilltown area in Western Mass has some of the best conservation opportunities statewide. We have intact forest and great wildlife habitat. We have land parcels that come in chunks of 100 or 150 acres rather than 10 or 15 acres. So conserving a parcel, which takes about the same amount of work, regardless of how large it is, can really have much more of an impact here. And as a result of this demand, really, Hilltown Land Trust has been able to increase our staffing, particularly in the land conservation and the land stewardship realms. So that has been really exciting. And that recent growth allows us to be more strategic and more proactive in how we approach conservation. So we can, you know, reach out to landowners who might be interested in conservation rather than just waiting for people to come to us, which tends to result in a patchwork of conservation. I will admit, it can be challenging to fund all of this. Individual land conservation projects are costly. There's the actual cost of the conservation land, and I will say we sometimes do receive donations of land, which is incredibly helpful. But there's a lot of transaction costs as well. There's ongoing stewardship costs, and then, of course, the increased staffing to support an organization where you have 5, 6, 7 people rather than one. And, this is where a lot of you come in. I know a lot of you are supporters of our organization and of conservation in general, and that really helps make high quality conservation projects like this possible. So we are just so grateful for that support and your interest in our organization. How can you help? As we've mentioned already, just sharing information with people about conservation options or alerting people to the fact that a land conservation organization might be able to help them think about the future of their land is really important, particularly if you're aware that the land has some special conservation values. Um, I also can't emphasize enough how important it is to have folks get involved in your town. A lot of all these small towns are really run by volunteers on committees, on open space committees or conservation commissions, trails committees, select boards, planning boards, etc. So getting involved in your town is incredibly helpful. A lot of conservation projects need some sort of town approval. Every conservation restriction needs to be signed off on by the select board in that town. And then many projects that receive funding that passes through the town needs to be approved at town meeting, or to have somebody in the town sort of lead the effort to seek that funding. So town involvement is really, really important. And then volunteering for, well, your town, but also your local land trust and other groups is great help to us all. What you see here is a team of trail volunteers that helped us build a trail in Goshen this past year. We do a lot of work at HLT with volunteers, monitoring properties, building trails, but also helping with events. And then, of course, our board and our committees are all volunteers as well. And then, of course, offering financial support or helping to put our organization in touch with people who might be able to give us financial support, introducing your friends to Hilltown Land Trust. These are all really helpful and important ways that people can be involved and can help this organization to thrive. I think that's the end of our more formal presentation. So, Sarah, should I open it up to the stop sharing maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yep, you can stop sharing, Sally, and we'll take questions now. You can use the Q&A function that is down at the bottom of your screen. It might be hiding under that more function. You can put it in the chat if you can't find the Q&A, but it's a lot easier for us to see the ones that come in through the Q&A. And we have a question already from Ivan. Hi, Ivan. I think the last time I saw you was actually at the Conwell Trails. Ivan is asking, the advantage of having Mass Wildlife hold the CR instead of having HLT hold it is access to their resources, I take it. Sally or Jess want to share a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that situation is interesting. We already had a fee land that we held title to in that area, so expanding that just made sense. And typically, Mass Wildlife doesn't really like the idea of holding conservation restrictions. Um, they'd rather hold title to the land itself. But in this particular situation, it made a lot of sense and seemed like we were going to do what right by the land and put our funding together and have a solid partnership by going that route. One of the issues is there wasn't a network of trails on that land that people were really enjoying. And Mass Wildlife doesn't tend to love trails or want to put effort into maintaining them because there is um, trails, wildlife and trails don't always mix. And so in an effort to allow public recreation on that land in the way that already was going on, it seemed to make sense for HLT to continue to hold title to the land. But that's a great question.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally. I'll also add as a piece of trivia that you can't hold a conservation restriction on land that you can't have the conservation restriction on land that you hold. So we have to work with partners when we are holding that land, because a conservation restriction is a legal document that involves monitoring to a certain legal standard. So we can't supervise ourselves in that way. And Mass Wildlife is one of the many partners who we work with to have that co-monitoring situation. Helps us do our best to adhere to the requirements of a conservation restriction.
Sarah.
Okay, we have a question from Mary. Mary is asking, do we make our annual reports available on our website?
Well, we're little and we don't have an annual report. So we certainly would if we had an annual report, but we don't at this moment have the capacity to put together an annual report.
Mm-hmm. Mary, something that we do is put together a twice-a-year newsletter that includes some of the material that would otherwise be going into an annual report, and that gets sent out to our members and our volunteers. Digital versions of it are also included on the website, so that's where you can get that higher level summary of what's going on at HLT. But yeah, we're very small, and an annual report is a big undertaking. Thanks for asking. Michael Leff is asking, hi, Michael. And Keith, I see your, you gotta tell me if you're raising your hand or just waving for
I'm
the
waving
back.
my hand. I'm
All
raising
right.
my hand because I can't find that on the spot here.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks, Keith. I'll get to you in a second.
right, thank you.
So Michael is asking, how do or don't these projects align with APRs, MDAR, or NRCS? And Jess or Sally, whoever answers, you get to also explain what those acronyms are.
Um, An APR is an agricultural
Reservation.
preservation restriction. And that is a tool to protect farmland forever as farmland. And in Massachusetts, APRs are almost exclusively held by the Department of Agricultural Resources. Though occasionally a land trust will take on a conservation restriction that's sort of written in the style of an APR. Um, so mostly those are a specific type of conservation option for land that's held by the state agency. And it's really aimed at keeping farmland affordable for farmers. And then what was your second one?
NRCS.
NRCS. So NRCS is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's a federal agency that does do work to permanently protect land through conservation restrictions or conservation easements, some of which are agricultural, some are specific to wetlands, and then I think some are more general. We haven't done those sorts of projects before. They tend to be big and complicated, and sometimes we leave those projects to our bigger peers. But we certainly have, explored those options. Not so much recently because the federal funding has just gotten a little kind of complicated, but that is a way in particular to fund a more expensive and complicated conservation project. Did you have more
Oh,
questions in there, Michael?
Yes, I was also just wondering about like if it was neighboring lands or just stitching together lands that are conserved one way or the other, and whether that would just be interesting to overlay the two and see if they're creating larger tracts of preserved land. But I guess with the ag use, it might actually be in conflict with some of what you're trying to do on wild lands.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because if we use that mass mapper tool, we can see what lands are protected in what way. And a lot of agricultural land that is protected, particularly in the hill towns, has a lot of forest associated with it. So yeah, sometimes it might be in conflict, but I think a lot of times it's not, and it's land that's not developed.
Jess, did you have something to add? And then we'll get to Keith and then Mary.
similar to what Sally just said, not necessarily. We look at it in context and just the diversity of all the lands kind of stitched together. It's gonna, strengthen the network no matter what. But like Sally said, there's not a whole lot of open ag land up in the hill towns.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. Um, if you have a question and are up for just shouting it out into the chat, like Keith is, feel free to use the hand raise function, and that also helps me see you. Keith, take it away.
Um, I followed Hilltown Land Trust for many years, and you all have done a terrific job out there. I mean, it's just incredible the amount of conservation and the partnership you've created. And I really like this expansion into wilderness management as well. I've been a forester for 50 years, worked on private lands all over, and I could say a lot of my clients over the years would always have areas of their property that they did not want anything to happen in that area. Let's not cut anything over there. And so, there's a lot of de facto wilderness already going on in the area, and the ability to try to codify that with a conservation restriction that, helps them manage that land in that way is going to be important in the future because it mixes well with farmland and with managed woodlands. It provides a great diverse landscape for wildlife and for people.
Yeah. Thanks,
Yeah.
Keith.
Thanks, Keith. Well said.
And I've got some projects I'll bring to you.
Sure. Bring them on. Although you said you're up in Warwick.
I work all over the Northeast
Awesome.
with private landowners. I work for Landvest, but I've started several land trusts in the region, and I'm familiar with the process. And it's just great to have you guys where you're located. That was always a hole for many years.
Glad to be filling it.
Ah, thank you, Steve. It's Keith, sorry, I'm looking at Steve's raised hand. Keith, that was lovely. Thank you. I'm gonna take this question from Mary and then go to Steve Goodwin. Mary is asking, what function does HLT's stewardship committee serve?
Do you
That's
want to
a
take
good
that one,
question.
Jess?
All of our committees they function as sounding boards. So anything that we're kind of planning to do or thinking of doing, or if we have complicated questions, we meet with the committees, regularly, and we check in. They're kind of a temperature reading, and a place that we can have open, deep discussions on how we are going to go about things and to stay on mission, is the
Yeah, that's a high level. And, we have a variety of committees, stewardship, project management, which deals with land conservation projects, engagement. And these committees all report to the board of directors. But a lot of the sort of roll up your sleeves, figuring it out work tends to happen at the committee level. So, do we want to put a public trail on this land? Who might we tap into as volunteers to help us with that trail? Or we need to monitor conservation restriction lands. And are we having a problem on one of those? Is there some thing that might be a violation of that conservation restriction? And then what are we going to do about that? So those are all issues that get channeled through the stewardship committee.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mary. Steve, I see your hand up. What you got?
I was curious about your all's philosophy around being the holder of the conservation restriction versus being the landowner, and especially as regard to staff time that creates for you. Because in both cases you have some responsibilities, and are there situations where you feel a lot more comfortable being the holder of the CR, or are you more likely to be comfortable being the landowner?
Wow.
That's a really good question.
I put that question to our projects committee a couple months ago. Uh, it's a little bit situational. Interestingly, one of our former board members shared that, for many years, Hilltown Land Trust preferred the conservation restriction option because they felt that was at a time when the organization was all volunteer, and it was felt like they could muster the volunteer capacity to go monitor lands once a year, but the responsibility of having to possibly manage that land was a little bit overwhelming for an all volunteer organization. I would say as we've shifted to being a staffed organization, we probably have tipped that preference towards holding title to the land, just because it gives us a little bit more control over the use and management of that land. We have conservation lands with conservation restrictions written in the 1990s that are not the document you would write today. And so sometimes practices happen on those lands, and they're allowed to happen on those lands that might not be really what's best for the land, but we can't really do anything about it. So our preference is probably more towards fee interest in the land or holding title to the land right now, but it sometimes depends on where the land is as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Do you happen to know where you are right now in terms of percentages of
Yeah,
how much land you have in where you hold the CR versus fee?
I can't give you the acreage because I don't have that in my head, but we have 10 properties that we hold title to, and then almost 40 conservation restrictions. The lands that we hold title to are bigger. So the acreage is more than 20%, but that's the numbers. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Good questions. These are all great questions. I'm having fun taking them. Let's see, from Glenn Ayers, is there a endowment fund for each property acquired to use for monitoring and or enforcement when needed? A great technical question, Glenn.
Wow, you're just feeding it to me. Thank you. Well, we talked about this question. Yes, the answer is yes. We do, and we are an accredited land trust, which is something that we get from the Land Trust Alliance. They're their Land Trust Accreditation Commission. And fun fact, almost any land trust, but certainly any accredited land trust is required to take on some sort of a stewardship endowment for each new conservation land that we take on. And that's to ensure that we have the resources in perpetuity to monitor that land and to defend it legally should any violations happen of that conservation restriction or intrusions. And then for land that we owned to just make sure that we can take care of it. So we do take on funding for each new conservation holding. That money can be tricky to raise, mainly in that none of the state grant funding programs and perhaps none of the federal ones either will support that expense. So we're always looking to private donations to support that cost, and it's a real cost. And we honestly probably haven't been taking on enough money for each of our conservation properties. So we're thinking about increasing the amount that we seek for each new conservation project. But, that is a really important part of the longevity of the relationship we have to the land or the conservation permanence. So yes, thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Let's see. All right, we have a few more moments, excuse me, a few more minutes left. Do we have any other questions?
I really appreciate just all the knowledge that clearly all of you have and are bringing to the table in terms of the questions that you're asking. These are the things that we think about all the time. In fact, I think the last two questions we answered were things that we've debated in our committees in the past couple months. So they're real issues that we face, but it's this is definitely the most exciting work I've ever done. Definitely my favorite job. So it's great to share it with more people, but it's just really exciting work. It's great to be doing something on behalf of your community and making connections for people, and getting outside as part of it.
I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm thinking unless anybody wants to slide in last minute, I can close us out. So a recording of this talk will be available online shortly. Give us a couple days and we'll put it on our YouTube channel where you can also see some of the amazing wildlife camera captures that have come out of our camera tracking, not just at the Jackson Brick Corridor, but across our service area and across our 13 towns. If you're interested in getting involved with some of that biodiversity monitoring that we do, we have an ongoing program where you can get involved with that. Sign up for our email mailing list if you're not already on it, if you would like to hear more about that. Thank you so much, Sally and Jess, for sharing more about this with us. Let's see. Yep, we have some additional trainings on along the stewardship lines coming up on May 16th and June 20th. We love bringing in outside speakers as well as our own staff to talk about this and get you connected to the resources that you can share widely within your communities. And thank you, Shippen. Thank you, Mary. And we love sharing about this work with you and the conservation and stewardship work that is so vital in this important region. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here. If you think of a question afterwards, feel free to email any of us at the email addresses that you see on your screen. And I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you all so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yep,
Thanks. Have a good evening.
you too. Bye-bye.